but I knew that if I didn't say it, that I would do it. And I just didn't want to be alive anymore.
Behind the mahogany paneling of Meghan Markle's bedroom at Frogmore Cottage sat a military-grade safe that nobody knew existed until now. Inside, secret recordings of the royal family, a hard drive labeled insurance, and financial records showing millions flowing through shadowy offshore accounts months before Meghan and Harry's dramatic exit. What investigators found was so devastating that the FBI launched an emergency operation, and suddenly the carefully crafted narrative of victims fleeing a cruel institution began to crumble under the weight of a very different truth. The discovery. The morning of March 17th began like any other at Frogmore Cottage. The spring sun filtered through the Georgian windows, casting long shadows across rooms that had once echoed with the laughter of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. But on this particular morning, something extraordinary was about to unfold. Something that would send shockwaves through the ancient corridors of Buckingham Palace and reach all the way across the Atlantic to the marble halls of FBI headquarters in Washington. The cottage had stood empty for months since Harry and Meghan's departure to California. Their lives had moved on, relocating to Montecito, where palm trees replaced oak groves and paparazzi helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures. But in Windsor, in this gracious cottage that Queen Elizabeth had gifted them, remnants of their royal life remained frozen in time. Estate manager Jonathan Ashworth had been tasked with overseeing the property's conversion. The cottage was being prepared for new occupants, part of the royal family's ongoing restructuring following the tumultuous departure of the Sussexes. It was routine work, or so everyone thought. Jonathan had supervised countless property transitions over his 23 years of service to the Crown. He knew every secret passage, every hidden alcove, every quirk of the historic properties dotting the Windsor estate. That morning, Jonathan arrived with a team of specialists. There were archivists from the Royal Collection, security personnel from the Metropolitan Police's Royal Protection Command, and contractors who would assess the cottage's physical structure. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass from the nearby gardens. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. The team moved through the cottage methodically. The nursery where Archie had spent his earliest months stood untouched, toys still arranged on shelves as if waiting for a child who would never return. The kitchen where Meghan had reportedly baked banana bread for neighbors remained pristine, copper pots hanging above marble countertops. Each room told a story of a life interrupted, of dreams deferred. It was in the primary bedroom suite that Jonathan made his discovery. The room was elegant yet understated, decorated in soft creams and gentle blues. A massive four-poster bed dominated the space, its linens long since removed and stored. Jonathan was examining the walk-in closet when his hand brushed against an irregularity in the mahogany paneling. His fingers traced what felt like a seam. Years of experience told him this was intentional, not a flaw in the craftsmanship. He pressed gently, then harder. There was a soft click, barely audible, and a section of the wall swung inward on hidden hinges. Behind the panel was a safe. Not just any safe, but a modern high-security model that seemed jarringly out of place in the historic cottage. It was roughly 2 feet square, made of reinforced steel with a digital keypad lock. The manufacturer's nameplate indicated it was a Guardian Elite series, the kind of safe used by executives protecting corporate secrets and diplomats safeguarding classified documents. Jonathan stepped back, his heart racing. In all his years managing royal properties, he had never encountered anything like this. Secret compartments were not uncommon in buildings that dated back centuries. The royal family's residences were filled with them, remnants of eras when privacy was achieved through clever architecture rather than legal protections. But a modern safe, hidden behind historic paneling, installed without authorization or documentation? This was unprecedented. He immediately contacted his supervisor, who contacted the master of the household, who contacted the private secretary to Her Majesty. Within 2 hours, the cottage was secured by additional security personnel. No one was permitted to enter or leave. The atmosphere transformed from routine inventory to something far more serious. By afternoon, specialists had arrived. There were locksmiths from a firm that held royal warrants, their discretion guaranteed by generations of service to the crown. Technical experts from GCHQ, Britain's signals intelligence agency, arrived with equipment to scan the safe for electronic countermeasures or booby traps. A representative from the Metropolitan Police's special branch stood by, ready to document whatever might be found. The question everyone was asking was simple yet profound. What could possibly be inside? And why had the Duchess of Sussex felt the need to hide it so carefully? Senior officials debated their next steps in hushed conferences on the cottage's lawn, far from potential listening devices. Some argued they should contact the Sussexes immediately, extend the courtesy of allowing them to explain. Others insisted that the safe's very existence, hidden and undisclosed, constituted a potential security breach that demanded immediate investigation. The legal implications were complex. The cottage was crown property, but Harry and Meghan had been granted its use. Did they have a right to install a safe? Certainly. Did they have an obligation to disclose it? That was less clear. But the manner of concealment behind false paneling suggested an intent to deceive that troubled even the most sympathetic observers. As the sun began to set over Windsor, casting the cottage in golden light, a decision was made at the highest levels. The safe would be opened. Whatever secrets it contained would be revealed. The electronic lock employed military-grade encryption. There were three options: obtain the code, bypass the electronics through sophisticated hacking, or destroy the safe completely, likely destroying its contents in the process. Hours turned into evening. Technicians worked by lamplight, their equipment casting eerie blue glows across the bedroom walls. They tried default codes, common combinations, dates significant to the Sussexes. Nothing worked. Each failed attempt resulted in the safe's security protocols becoming more stringent, the lockout periods extending longer. It was nearly midnight when a young technician from GCHQ, a woman named Sarah Chen who specialized in cryptography, had a breakthrough. She had been analyzing the safe's electronic signature, the unique pattern of signals it emitted. There was an anomaly, a weakness in how the safe communicated with its internal components. It was not a flaw in the safe's design, but rather in how it had been installed and configured. Working through the night, Sarah and her team constructed a sophisticated electronic bypass. It was delicate work, requiring them to intercept and manipulate the safe's internal communications without triggering its tamper-evident features. One mistake would permanently lock the safe, potentially destroying any evidence of what lay within. Dawn was breaking over Windsor when Sarah finally nodded to Jonathan. The moment had arrived. With dozens of officials watching, with cameras documenting every second, with the weight of royal protocol and national security hanging in the balance, she entered the final sequence of commands into her laptop. There was a mechanical whir, a series of clicks. Then, with a hydraulic hiss that seemed impossibly loud in the silent room, the safe's door swung open. The contents. The safe's interior was revealed in the harsh glare of portable lights that investigators had set up around the bedroom. What they found inside would prove far more complex and troubling than anyone had anticipated. The safe was not filled with jewels or cash or any of the conventional valuables one might expect. Instead, it contained documents, electronic storage devices, and items that would require weeks of analysis to fully understand. Jonathan Ashworth, who had discovered the safe and earned the right to witness its opening, found himself looking at orderly stacks of materials. Everything was meticulously organized, sealed in protective plastic sleeves, labeled with dates and cryptic codes. This was not the hurried concealment of stolen goods. The first category of items was perhaps the most immediately shocking: financial records. Not personal bank statements or tax returns, but something far more significant. There were ledgers, both physical and digital, documenting money trails that seemed to stretch across continents. Corporate structures registered in places like Delaware, the Cayman Islands, and Luxembourg. Bank accounts in Switzerland and Singapore. Investment vehicles whose ownership was obscured behind layers of shell companies and trusts. Documents suggested transactions totaling tens of millions of pounds, possibly more. The paper trail was incomplete, likely deliberately so, but what remained painted a picture of financial complexity that seemed at odds with what the public knew about the Sussexes' wealth. One document in particular caught investigators' attention. It was a contract dated 18 months before Harry and Meghan's departure from royal duties, between a corporate entity registered in Delaware and several media companies. The contract outlined what appeared to be a deal for exclusive rights to the Sussexes' story, their images, their brand. The sums involved were enormous, guarantees and projections that ran into 9 figures. But it was the timing that troubled investigators most. This contract predated the Sussexes' public announcement of their intention to step back from royal duties. It suggested planning, coordination, negotiations happening in secret while Harry and Meghan were still working members of the royal family. It raised uncomfortable questions about when the decision to leave had truly been made and what financial incentives might have influenced that decision. The second category was even more sensitive: communications. The safe contained multiple hard drives, USB drives, and what appeared to be backups for mobile phones. These were clearly labeled by date, suggesting they contained archived messages, emails, and possibly recordings spanning years. Investigators could not immediately access these drives. They were encrypted with sophisticated protection that would require specialized forensic analysis, but metadata visible on the drive's labels suggested their contents were explosive. There were references to conversations with senior royals, with palace staff, with media figures, and with political operatives. One drive was simply labeled insurance. That single word in Meghan's handwriting, according to later analysis, sent chills through everyone present. In the context of sensitive documents and communications, insurance typically meant one thing: leverage. Information kept as protection against future threats, material that could be released if negotiations broke down or if the holder felt threatened. The third category consisted of legal documents. There were draft lawsuits, never filed, against British tabloids far beyond the cases that had become public. There were cease and desist letters prepared, but apparently never sent. There were legal opinions on everything from Harry's security arrangements to the intellectual property rights in royal photographs to the enforceability of non-disclosure agreements. Most disturbingly, there were documents related to recordings, transcripts of conversations, with dates and locations meticulously noted. The transcripts were fragmentary, single pages rather than complete documents, but they referenced discussions that appeared highly confidential. The fourth category was perhaps the most personally damaging: dossiers on individuals. There were files on palace staff members, on certain members of the royal family, on journalists and photographers. These files contained detailed information, personal details that could only have been obtained through systematic research or surveillance. One file focused on Kate, the Princess of Wales. It contained photographs, apparently taken without Kate's knowledge, in various private moments. There were notes on her schedule, her habits, the schools her children attended. The level of detail suggested either dedicated surveillance or access to privileged information that should never have been shared outside secure channels. Another file concerned palace staff members who had left the Sussexes' employment. There were notes on their backgrounds, their vulnerabilities, their financial situations. Next to some names were check marks or crosses, as if tracking who might be sympathetic to the Sussexes' narrative and who might not. The fifth and final category was the most puzzling: items that seemed to have cultural or historical significance. There were photographs of documents from the royal archives, images apparently taken covertly during private tours or privileged access. There were copies of letters written by previous members of the royal family, documents that should have remained sealed under royal protocol. Most controversially, there appeared to be items of jewelry, small pieces whose provenance was unclear. Were these personal gifts? Were they pieces from the royal collection that should have been returned upon the Sussexes' departure? Without expert analysis, it was impossible to say, but their presence in a hidden safe rather than displayed openly or stored properly raised immediate red flags. As dawn fully broke and investigators completed their initial catalog, Detective Chief Inspector Roberts made a secure call to his superiors at Scotland Yard. What they had found transcended the usual boundaries of royal privacy disputes or celebrity squabbles. This was potentially serious criminal activity involving possible financial crimes, violation of privacy laws, and misappropriation of property. The question became, what to do next? The royal family traditionally handled internal matters internally, away from public scrutiny and criminal prosecution. But the scale and nature of what had been found made that traditional approach untenable. These were not minor indiscretions that could be managed through quiet conversations and discreet settlements. Moreover, some of the documents suggested connections beyond British jurisdiction. There were references to American companies, American lawyers, American media deals. If crimes had been committed, they might have international dimensions that required cooperation between authorities in multiple countries. It was at this point that the decision was made to contact the American authorities, not through normal diplomatic channels, which would have been slow and bureaucratic, but through direct law enforcement cooperation. The Metropolitan Police reached out to their counterparts in the FBI. The FBI involvement. The call came through to FBI headquarters in Washington on a secure line shortly after 6 in the morning Eastern Time. Special Agent Jennifer Morrison, who headed the Bureau's International Corruption Unit, was already at her desk when her phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Detective Chief Inspector Malcolm Roberts, calling from Windsor, England. Morrison listened intently as Roberts outlined what had been discovered. Her years of experience investigating financial crimes and international corruption had taught her to recognize significant cases quickly. What Roberts was describing was not just significant, it was potentially explosive. The FBI's interest was not primarily about Meghan Markle's status as a duchess or her royal connections. The Bureau's mandate focused on violations of American law, and several aspects of what Roberts described potentially fell under federal jurisdiction. Financial transactions involving American banks or companies, wire fraud crossing international boundaries, potential violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, money laundering through American financial institutions. These were all matters that could justify FBI involvement. Within hours, a team was assembled. Morrison selected 6 experienced agents, each bringing specialized expertise. There were financial crime specialists who could unravel complex corporate structures and money trails. There were computer forensics experts who could analyze the encrypted drives. There was a legal advisor who specialized in international jurisdiction and the unique complications that arose when investigations touched upon foreign governments or diplomatic entities. FBI forensic accountants, working with their British counterparts from the National Crime Agency, began to trace the money trails. What they discovered was a financial structure of remarkable sophistication. Dozens of corporate entities, each carefully constructed to obscure ownership and purpose. Money flowing between accounts in intricate patterns, often passing through multiple jurisdictions before reaching its final destination. The deeper investigators dug, the more troubling the picture became. There were payments from companies owned by the Sussexes to entities whose ownership was impossible to determine. There were consulting fees paid to corporations that appeared to have no employees, no offices, no legitimate business purpose. There were transfers to accounts in jurisdictions known for banking secrecy and minimal financial oversight. One pattern particularly interested the FBI team. Substantial sums had been transferred to American media companies, payments that predated any public announcement of the Sussexes' media deals. These payments were described in banking records as consulting fees, advance payments, or option agreements, but their timing and structure suggested they might be something else entirely. Payments for guaranteed favorable coverage, for control over narratives, for the ability to shape public perception. If these payments were indeed attempts to influence media coverage without proper disclosure, they might violate American communications laws and regulations governing transparency in media. It took 3 days of continuous work, but eventually the FBI's digital forensics team achieved a breakthrough. They gained access to one of the drives, the one labeled Insurance. What they found justified every concern that label had raised. The drive contained recordings, hours and hours of audio files, meticulously organized and indexed. There were conversations between Harry and his father, then Prince Charles. There were calls between Meghan and palace staff. There were meetings with lawyers, with publicists, with media advisors. Many of these recordings appeared to have been made without the knowledge or consent of the other parties. The content was devastating. In conversations with palace staff, Meghan could be heard making disparaging remarks about senior royals, comments that directly contradicted her public statements about wanting to work collaboratively with the institution. There were discussions of media strategy that revealed a calculated approach to public relations, planning how to leverage royal status for commercial gain, while publicly claiming to seek privacy. Most damaging were recordings of conversations between Harry and Meghan themselves, private discussions where they spoke candidly about their plans. In these recordings, they discussed timing their departure from royal duties to maximize public sympathy. They talked about which media outlets would be most useful for shaping their narrative. They strategized about how to maintain enough royal connection to preserve their marketability while escaping the constraints of actual royal duty. One conversation dated 6 months before their public announcement was particularly revealing. In it, Meghan and Harry discussed the financial opportunities available to them if they could successfully position themselves as victims of an oppressive institution. They talked about book deals, speaking fees, media productions. They estimated the monetary value of their story, placing it in the hundreds of millions of dollars. There were conversations with American talent agents, with executives from streaming platforms, with publishers. These conversations often involved discussions of deals, contracts, and financial arrangements that had never been publicly disclosed. American tax law requires residents to report all income, regardless of source. If Harry and Meghan, who had become American residents, had failed to properly report income from these early deals, they could face tax fraud charges. If they had made false statements in applications for visas or other immigration documents about their financial circumstances or intentions, they could face immigration fraud charges. Moreover, some of the conversations suggested that confidential information about royal activities and plans had been shared with American media companies, potentially giving those companies unfair commercial advantages. This raised questions about securities fraud, insider trading, and other violations of American business law. As the investigation progressed, the FBI team compiled a detailed timeline. It showed that planning for the Sussexes' departure had begun far earlier than previously known. It showed financial negotiations happening in parallel with public statements of commitment to royal duty. It showed a level of coordination between the Sussexes and certain media outlets that called into question the independence of coverage those outlets had provided. The evidence suggested that what the public had been told was a spontaneous decision driven by emotional distress was actually a carefully planned business strategy, executed over months with legal and financial advice from teams of professionals. The international implications. The investigation's scope expanded dramatically as connections emerged that neither British nor American authorities had initially anticipated. What had begun as the discovery of a hidden safe had evolved into a complex international investigation touching upon multiple jurisdictions, involving questions of law that straddled the boundaries between criminal and civil matters, between public and private interests. The royal family found itself in an unprecedented position. For centuries, the monarchy had carefully maintained a separation between its public role as Britain's constitutional head of state and its private affairs as a family. Internal disputes, personal conflicts, financial arrangements, these had always been handled discreetly, away from public scrutiny and criminal investigation. But what the safe revealed made that traditional approach impossible. The palace's private secretary, Sir Edward Hamilton, a career diplomat who had served 3 monarchs, found himself navigating uncharted waters. He coordinated with government ministers, with law enforcement agencies, with the palace's legal team, trying to balance competing interests. The monarchy's dignity and reputation needed protection, but so did the rule of law. The institution could not be seen to receive special treatment, to place itself above the standards applied to ordinary citizens. The British government faced equally complex challenges. The relationship between the Crown and elected government was delicate, defined more by tradition and convention than by written law. The government could not direct the royal family's actions, but neither could it ignore potential criminal activity simply because it involved individuals connected to the monarchy. Prime Minister Sarah Mitchell, only 18 months into her tenure, convened an emergency meeting of senior ministers and advisors. The Foreign Secretary was concerned about diplomatic implications. The Home Secretary worried about security issues. The Chancellor of the Exchequer needed to understand potential financial impacts. The Attorney General had to consider questions of prosecution and immunity. They met in the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street, the secure chamber where Britain's most sensitive decisions were made. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone present understood that how they handled this situation could have repercussions extending far beyond the immediate question of what to do about evidence found in a safe. Foreign Secretary David Thompson outlined his concerns. Meghan was an American citizen. Harry, while British, was now residing in America and had strong American connections. Any prosecution or public accusation would inevitably strain relations between Britain and the United States. The two nations were close allies, bound by language, culture, and shared strategic interests. The political optics were treacherous. Any move against Meghan risked being portrayed as racist, as establishment retribution, as an old-fashioned institution crushing a modern woman who had sought to bring change. Never mind that the evidence suggested serious crimes. Never mind that the rules applied to Meghan were the same rules that applied to everyone. Perception would matter more than reality. Home Secretary James Bradley focused on security concerns. Some of the documents and recordings touched upon royal protection arrangements, security protocols, sensitive information about how the royal family was kept safe. If this information had been compromised, if it had been shared with unauthorized parties, or could potentially become public through legal proceedings, it created genuine security risks. The royal family's security was not just a private matter, it was a matter of national security. Threats against the monarchy came from terrorists, from unstable individuals, from political extremists. Every detail about security arrangements that became public made protection more difficult and more dangerous. Chancellor Rebecca Foster raised financial concerns. If it emerged that members of the royal family had been involved in tax avoidance or financial manipulation, it would inevitably lead to questions about the monarchy's broader financial arrangements. The sovereign grant, the income from the Duchy of Cornwall, the private wealth of senior royals, all of these would face renewed scrutiny and criticism. Many of the activities suggested by the documents might be civil matters rather than criminal ones. Contracts might have been breached, but breach of contract was not generally a criminal offense. Privacy might have been violated, but privacy law in Britain was primarily civil law, remedied through lawsuits rather than criminal prosecution. However, some matters clearly did rise to the level of potential criminal conduct. As discussions continued in Downing Street, parallel conversations were happening in Washington. The FBI's involvement had necessitated briefing senior Justice Department officials. Attorney General Michael Chen received regular updates from Special Agent Morrison and her team. He, in turn, briefed the White House. President Elizabeth Warren's administration faced its own delicate balancing act. If Meghan received special treatment because of her celebrity or her connections, it would undermine the principle of equal justice under law. The State Department was particularly concerned about how the investigation might affect broader US-UK relations. The special relationship between the two countries was real, but required constant maintenance. Britain was America's most reliable ally, supporting American foreign policy even when it was domestically unpopular. The intelligence sharing between the two nations was unparalleled. Military cooperation was extensive. Allowing a celebrity scandal to damage this relationship would be strategically foolish. Yet both nations were committed to the rule of law. Both nations' publics expected their governments to pursue justice regardless of who might be implicated. Finding a path that satisfied both strategic interests and legal principles would require careful diplomacy. Representatives from both governments began quiet, unofficial discussions. These were not formal negotiations. Nothing was being negotiated. Rather, they were conversations about how to manage a situation that neither government had anticipated and that both found deeply awkward. Senior diplomats, speaking carefully, explored options and boundaries. One possibility was to handle everything through civil processes rather than criminal prosecution. The royal family could sue for return of property, for damages from privacy violations, for breach of contract. The civil courts could award remedies without requiring public trials and public testimony. But this approach had significant limitations. Civil cases could drag on for years. Appeals could extend matters even longer. And civil cases, unlike criminal cases, required the plaintiffs to actively pursue them. Did the royal family really want to spend years in litigation with Harry and Meghan? Did they want to be seen as vindictively pursuing the Sussexes through the courts? Moreover, civil remedies could not address everything. If crimes had been committed, particularly crimes involving American financial institutions or American tax law, the government had an obligation to prosecute. Justice could not be bought off through settlements and payments. The resolution. 3 weeks after the safe was first discovered, officials from both governments had reached a tentative understanding of how to proceed. It was not a perfect solution. Perfect solutions rarely existed in situations this complicated, but it represented a carefully crafted balance between competing interests and principles. The royal family would not pursue criminal charges in Britain. This decision was framed as an exercise of royal prerogative, a choice to prioritize family privacy and institutional dignity over retribution. Privately, officials acknowledged it was also a pragmatic recognition that criminal prosecution would be extraordinarily difficult, would consume years, and would keep the scandal in public attention indefinitely. However, the royal family would pursue civil action to recover property and to obtain damages for documented harms. These lawsuits would be filed quietly, handled by discreet law firms known for protecting high-profile clients' interests. The cases would likely settle before trial, with terms kept confidential through non-disclosure agreements. The FBI's investigation would continue, but with a narrowed focus. American authorities would examine potential violations of American law, tax fraud, wire fraud, violations of financial regulations, but they would do so carefully, ensuring that any charges brought could be sustained by evidence that did not require British royal participation in American legal proceedings. This meant certain matters would not be pursued. The recordings, however problematic morally and however much they violated British privacy expectations, did not clearly violate American law. Meghan was an American citizen, and American law was generally more permissive about recording conversations than British law. Harry and Meghan were informed of these decisions through their attorneys. The conversations were tense. Their lawyers argued that their clients had done nothing wrong, that the examination of the safe's contents was an invasion of privacy, that any prosecution would be vindictive persecution. But beneath the legal posturing, there was clear recognition of how serious the situation had become. Harry and Meghan wanted other things. They wanted to avoid criminal prosecution. They wanted to protect their commercial ventures and media deals, which could be destroyed by criminal convictions or even by serious legal troubles. They wanted to preserve, as much as possible, their public image and their ability to continue earning substantial income from their royal connections. Media coverage would be managed through carefully coordinated statements that emphasized reconciliation and moving forward, rather than dwelling on past disputes. The public announcement was bland and uninformative, precisely as designed. The royal family released a statement noting that administrative matters related to the Sussexes' transition had been satisfactorily resolved. Harry and Meghan issued their own statement, expressing gratitude for the opportunity to clarify misunderstandings. Neither statement mentioned the safe, the FBI investigation, or any specific details of what had been found or resolved. Media coverage was initially skeptical. Reporters knew something significant had happened, too many officials had been involved, too much activity had occurred at Windsor, too many lawyers had suddenly been retained. But without official confirmation and without documents to substantiate speculation, most major outlets reported the basic statements and moved on to other stories. Tabloids were less restrained, but their speculation was so disconnected from reality that it actually helped obscure the truth. Wild theories about stolen jewels, secret recordings of the Queen, blackmail plots, these were close enough to reality to seem plausible, but different enough in details that they could be dismissed as typical tabloid exaggeration. At Windsor, Frogmore Cottage was finally converted for new occupants. The bedroom where the safe had been hidden was repainted, the closet's false paneling permanently sealed. New residents would never know what had been concealed there, what secrets had been hidden behind elegant mahogany. The safe itself was removed and secured in a police evidence facility. It would remain there for years, a physical reminder of the investigation. Harry and Meghan continued their lives in California, their media ventures proceeding as planned. But those close to them noticed changes. They were more cautious in what they said publicly about the royal family. Their criticism, once pointed and personal, became more general and abstract. Projects that had been announced with great fanfare quietly disappeared or were significantly modified. Relationships within the royal family remained fractured. The discovery of the safe and its contents had confirmed the worst suspicions of those who had questioned Meghan's motivations and Harry's judgment. Trust, once broken so thoroughly, could not be easily restored. But there was at least a grudging détente, an acceptance that public warfare served no one's interests. Years would pass before the full story began to emerge. Retired officials would write memoirs with careful language about matters that required delicate handling. Journalists would piece together partial accounts from multiple sources, getting closer to truth without ever quite reaching it. Historians would note this period as a particularly turbulent time for the monarchy, a crisis weathered but not without cost. The deeper questions raised by the discovery remained largely unexamined. What did it mean that a member of the royal family had felt the need to secretly document and hide evidence? What did it suggest about trust within the institution, about the relationship between individual royals and the monarchy's collective interests? How had someone gained access to confidential information that should have been better protected? These questions mattered because they went beyond Harry and Meghan's particular situation. They touched upon fundamental issues about how ancient institutions adapted to modern realities, about privacy in an age of ubiquitous recording and documentation, about the tension between personal autonomy and collective obligation. The royal family implemented new security measures, background checks became more thorough. Access to confidential information was more strictly controlled. Staff members signed more comprehensive non-disclosure agreements. Technology policies were updated to address recording devices and electronic communications. But policies and procedures could only do so much. The real challenge was cultural, about building an environment where people felt heard and respected, where concerns could be raised and addressed, where individuals did not feel driven to secret documentation as protection against an oppressive system. Whether these lessons were truly learned remained unclear. Institutions changed slowly, especially institutions as old and tradition-bound as the British monarchy. The hope was that this crisis, painful as it had been, might ultimately lead to positive reforms. The fear was that it would simply lead to greater secrecy, to higher walls and more carefully guarded communications. In Montecito, in the Sussex's mansion overlooking the Pacific, life went on. The California sun shone on manicured gardens. Security guards monitored perimeter cameras. Inside, Harry and Meghan worked on their various projects, gave interviews, and attended to their children. They had achieved what they sought: freedom from royal constraints, financial independence, control over their narrative. But they had also lost something: the sense of belonging to an ancient institution, the connection to centuries of history, the security of knowing one's place in a grand continuity. They had chosen autonomy over tradition, and that choice had consequences both expected and unexpected. Whether they would ever truly reconcile with the family they had left behind remained uncertain. The discovery of the safe and everything it represented had deepened wounds that were already severe. But time had a way of healing even the deepest rifts, or at least of making them less acutely painful. The palace gates closed as Windsor settled into darkness, but in secure vaults spanning 2 continents the evidence remained. Explosive recordings, damning documents, secrets powerful enough to destroy reputations and unravel carefully constructed lies. The settlement had bought silence, but it couldn't erase the truth of what investigators had found behind that hidden panel. And in Montecito, as Meghan and Harry smiled for cameras and spoke of healing and moving forward, they knew that somewhere in those sealed files lay proof of exactly how their fairy tale had really ended, not with victims fleeing persecution, but with calculated architects of their own lucrative escape.